Hello, my name is Marianne Veneers. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for International Trade and Transportation and Deputy Director of the Medtrans Transportation Center at California State University, Long Beach. The video you're about to see includes two scenarios about the future of goods movement in Southern California. Both scenarios are fictional, highly speculative, and take place in the future, in the year 2025. These scenarios were produced to stimulate discussions at CITT's Point Counterpoint Forum held on March 28, 2012. The forum was recorded and the webcast can be viewed at www.ccpe.csurb.edu/CITT. Again, both scenarios are fictional and involve creative license for dramatic effect. Neither CITT nor Medtrans endorse either of these two visions. We provided them in the spirit of opening up a dialogue. Please enjoy the video.
Welcome to the Southland News Network 6 o'clock report on this day, April 1st, 2025. I'm your host, Bob Perkins. Now, our top story tonight involves the record-breaking numbers from the twin ports in the San Pedro Bay. Both the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach are moving consumer goods at a phenomenal rate. Officials estimate that between the two ports, nearly 25 million TEUs, that's 25 million 20-foot equivalent containers, will pass through the local goods movement system this year. These volumes would have been unattainable 15 years ago. So looking back at those difficult years, between 2009 and 2012, it was tough to envision the future level of demand and the simultaneous environmental sustainability of the harbor. As part of that backdrop, there was a general economic malaise across the national landscape. It was also a time of congressional gridlock and massive federal and state budget deficits. To make matters worse, there were major disagreements, regionally, locally, and within the community, over the issues of growth, land use, air quality, quality of life, the scope of adequate infrastructure improvement, and technological upgrades with the labor's-related concerns. All of these unresolved issues threaten to accelerate a market share decline in the San Pedro Bay as the world economy suffered through several serious downturns. At the time, competition for jobs and cargo intensified as newer corridors through Canada, Mexico, and the expanded Panama Canal made alternative ports and delivery routes for shippers much more attractive. To help analyze our past and how we successfully navigated the transition toward achieving today's milestone announcement, we have with us on a live link Dr. Jeremy Sanders. Dr. Sanders is an economist and a professor of transportation and urban planning at South Bay University. Welcome, Dr. Sanders, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, Bob.
Okay, so let's cut to the chase, sir. Given all the problems I just mentioned in 2009 to 2012, how did the situation in the San Pedro Bay and in goods movement generally finally get turned around? I mean, some folks thought we were going to become an afterthought in goods movement with discretionary cargo taking flight through Panama, Canada, Seattle, Tacoma.
Well, from my perspective, looking back, I believe the pivotal moment occurred during the election cycle of 2012. All of the negative economic factors you mentioned were at play. Unemployment was hovering around 8.5% nationally and between 10 and 12% in California. What happened was there was a kind of group epiphany that occurred among all stakeholders in the local goods movement industry. The first part of the epiphany was realizing that with all of the political gridlock and the massive government debt load, the elections were not going to save us from economic and social decline.
Oh, okay. So what was the second part of the epiphany, as you say?
The second part of the epiphany was recognizing that industry and community leaders had to move forward with a working plan that would direct us toward a kind of green prosperity, if you will. Green can be interpreted in two different ways, both the environmental sustainability aspect and the ability to generate the dollars, greenbacks, it takes to support industry and all of the dynamism it provides.
So what were some of the outcomes of that epiphany? I mean, certainly there must have been many factors motivating a change in the status quo.
Of the many changes that occurred, the primary and most important one was the desire to meet each other halfway. This spirit was embodied by everyone involved within the industry, local government, and the community. Many were certainly motivated by enlightened self-interest, but nonetheless, the movement toward collaboration was the key. One of the results of this collaboration was the creation of a joint powers regional goods movement authority known as the RGMA.
And what was the point of this RGMA?
The purpose of the Regional Goods Movement Authority was to provide oversight, strategic planning, direction, and yes, assess and collect fees as appropriate to stimulate change and improvement. The RGMA kept the focus on two things, efficiency and environmental sustainability. To some, it was a big surprise that sustainability and growth could occur simultaneously, actually in concert with one another in a complementary fashion.
Okay, so let's break it down further. On the one hand, industry was always looking for opportunities to grow, but on the other hand, the community activists perceived more trucks and trains and containers as simply more pollution and more congestion and more health problems and a reduced standard of living. So how did that basic contradiction become reconciled?
There were good reasons for both sides to give ground when compromising for the benefit of the other side. In the case of industry, regardless of state legislative action or civil litigation, it was clear that congestion and pollution had to be mitigated as much as possible just to make the terminals and surrounding areas functional at a higher volume level. Now, when you solve the congestion issue, you've also started to solve a big part of the pollution issue. Using alternative fuels, cleaner trucks, and natural gas vehicles helps tremendously, as does implementing alternative marine powering for ships at berth. Also, as a practical matter, it's hard to work in an environment that disables the workers because the air quality is so poor. No one wants to wear a gas mask just to be able to go to work at the docks.
So you mentioned the grueling litigation by residents living in the shadows of the big cranes. Now, many of those litigants had experienced trucks jamming the freeways during rush hour. And one response by the industry was the Pier Pass program. And as we know, expanding the logistical operations usually entails expanding the physical facilities and jump-starting more developments like the near dock rail terminals that we now have in place. So how did industry and the community come together in a way that allowed for this kind of development and expansion in light of the earlier concerns by that same community?
Well, you identified the Pier Pass program, which successfully incentivized the industry to spread out delivery times. Now, under Pier Pass, we avoided having all of the trucks lining up between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. during the heart of the morning rush hour and the rest of the business day. In addition to Pier Pass, there were major new developments in technology that enabled the trucks to become what we called smarter. This technology made the trucks more efficient in terms of appointments, arrival times, and locating preferred non-congestive traffic routes via GPS devices and the equivalent smart gates at the terminals.
So were there other technological advancements that improved efficiency and sustainability?
Absolutely. In addition to the smarter trucks and cleaner trucks, the electrification process at the terminals, which involved implementing cold ironing, eliminated the use of heavily polluting bunker fuel in ships. Ships in port were always one of the major sources of air pollution. Another technological advancement suggested by the RGMA involved an across-the-board implementation of consistent software standards at the terminals. Now, this made the continuity between terminals much more fluid and flexible. Software continuity helped facilitate more efficient movement through the gates. For labor, it was an advantage because skills became more transportable from one terminal to the next.
So the story is really about discretionary cargo, those goods that arrive at a port but are destined for regions beyond a 400-mile radius. And that's where the real cargo growth and demand occurs, correct?
Yes, that's where the San Pedro Bay had an advantage in terms of capacity and geography, especially when the majority of goods were coming from China and places like Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Taiwan, etc. When some of the manufacturing sectors shifted to emerging markets such as India and Latin America, our enhanced capacity was a key advantage in handling imported goods from those areas as well. Wherever the discretionary cargo comes from, it takes a well-developed rail system to make the intermodal delivery system work. Lots of trains require lots of grade separations if you are going to keep things moving without bringing urban streets to a standstill. The Alameda Corridor was the model for the grade separation process, which continued developing under the RGMA's guidance.
Doctor, I want to address the community's reaction to all of this and how the activists were able to find common ground with the industry and its growth.
Well, for the community, I think there were several issues that mattered. The high unemployment rate, hovering for several years, had made everyone concerned. Often you heard people saying any job is a good job in a tough economic environment. It became clear that a lot of the jobs related to the ports and warehousing were not just good jobs, they were really great jobs compared to work in other service sectors that offered low pay. Now, the recognition occurred that the harbor was not just a generator of pollution and traffic, but was also the lifeblood of the community in terms of economic activity. I'm sure that realization was the most important factor. Now, when it became clear that reducing goods movement meant adding more friends and neighbors to the unemployment line, self-interest began to swing in favor of compromise on litigation issues. Foreclosures and abandoned houses and local shops closing down have a way of getting people's attention at the neighborhood level.
But what about all the important health and lifestyle issues people expressed?
Health issues were always a concern for the community, as you would expect. Ultimately, people tend to feel healthier and have a better life when they have a job, as opposed to when they've been unemployed. Cleaner trucks and alternative fuels also made the air cleaner, so the industry was starting to pass the all-important smell test, quite literally and figuratively. I also think it became more obvious that a productive, thriving industry generates the funding for more progressive technologies and services that can not only clean up after the industry, but also contribute to improving the quality of life in the urban sphere.
Was there anything else the feds did to help the San Pedro Bay in terms of environmental mitigation?
Well, because local industry and local leaders took control of matters in the harbor, the feds were able to assist the local efforts and cast an approving eye on the environmental programs underway in these green ports. Perhaps the most helpful thing done at the federal level was the development of a national transportation strategy for goods movement.
So how did this national transportation strategy enhance the green ports movement?
Specifically on the ecological side, the National Transportation Strategy adopted consistent standards across the board for clean air and environmental considerations at all marine terminals in the U.S. Now, with these provisions affecting every port more or less equally, the West Coast was no longer perceived as being too green to be business friendly. It really helped level the playing field. In the end, forcing the industry to upgrade and become greener was to the advantage of the local operations once the national standards came into effect. The LA Long Beach Harbor had already done a lot of the heavy lifting that other ports around the country were forced to do later at great expense.
Doctor, in the few seconds we have left in this segment, could you give us a final thought to consider as we celebrate the success of the San Pedro Bay?
But before I say goodbye, I just want to say in summary that I've made it sound like all of these positive developments came about quickly, rather easily and smoothly. The truth is, these accomplishments we're talking about today, with 25 million TEUs traveling through a green, environmentally friendly system, occurred after a lot of effort, a lot of planning, collaboration, and a lot of just plain hard work. It was more than a dozen years in the making. Now, you have to think in terms of at least a decade when improving your goods movement process.
Okay, I think we'll leave on that note. Thank you again for joining us, Dr. Sanders.
Again, my pleasure, Bob.
Okay, we'll be right back. Welcome to the Southland News Network 6 o'clock report on this day, April 1st, 2025. I'm your host, Bob Perkins. We open our newscast with another huge warehouse fire in the Southland. This is the third abandoned warehouse to go up in flames in the past 10 days. This time it's in eastern Los Angeles County. The first one was in the harbor area and the second one in San Bernardino County. So far, no one has come forward to claim credit for any of these fires, and authorities do not know if there is any connection between the three blazes other than a possible copycat motive with the last two. What these fires do have in common is they all occur at night. All three of the buildings were completely empty. Containing these infernos requires significant resources from local firefighting agencies because the fires involved huge structures. There is always the threat that flames will spread to adjacent buildings. We've invited a guest with an interesting perspective on the fires to join us tonight for a discussion about them. He is Dr. Jeremy Sanders, an economist and a professor of transportation and urban planning studies at South Bay University. He is with us on Live Link. Welcome, Dr. Sanders, and thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me, though I wish it was under better circumstances.
So, Professor, what's going on out there with these warehouse fires from your perspective, both as an economist and an expert on urban transportation?
Unfortunately, Bob, I see these fires as a symbolic end or a flaming out, if you will, of a largely hollowed out industry in Southern California. Now, looking back 20 to 25 years ago, we had a thriving, growing goods movement industry here. It once burned brightly as the source of energy and dynamism for the local economy, which was reeling from a loss of manufacturing jobs. Now, however, because discretionary cargo has moved on to other channels and other regions, the industry has dramatically contracted, so the abiding source of energy, growth, and opportunity is melting away. One after another, these past 10 days, we've seen the abandoned vestiges of that industry burn to the core. Now, if you look at it in apocalyptic terms, the metaphorical analogy would be something like the sun burning out in the sky after heating the earth for many years with life-giving energy.
Sir, that's quite a powerful analogy. And so I'm wondering, what have we lost from the contraction of the goods movement industry in Southern California, and why should we be concerned about it?
I could write a book about all of the lost opportunities and consequences of this contraction. In fact, that's going to be my next project. In summary, we've given away one of the best opportunities we had to keep a strong job base and a vibrant, growing local economy. As I mentioned a moment ago, when we lost the manufacturing jobs that started here during World War II and remained until the early 1990s, 50 years of solid, stable, middle-class employment drifted away and left us with a major social and economic decline that lasted for about 7 years. Old-timers in the real estate business remember it well. One of the industries that developed rapidly and stepped up to provide new opportunities and new relatively high-paying jobs for the blue-collar working class was the goods movement industry. There were abundant jobs for longshoremen and clerks, truck drivers, warehouse workers, freight managers, and freight forwarders. We also had lots of jobs for railroad employees and all manner of logistics personnel.
So are you suggesting these jobs and goods movement sustain the community? How did that happen?
Well, we need to emphasize the multiplier effect. One job with one paycheck not only helps to support a single family, it also contributes to supporting other jobs and businesses in the community. The vast majority of a typical paycheck is spent to cover items like mortgages, car payments, groceries, clothing, and basic supplies and essentials. What's left over often pays for various forms of education, entertainment, and travel. The multiplier effect keeps the dollar circulating throughout the community and provides local businesses with opportunities to expand and hire new employees. Banks and credit unions also become stronger when people have money available for new accounts and also when people have the ability to afford loans for new purchases.
So what happens when a local industry experiences a steep decline?
When we have an industry in contraction, jobs are lost and the multiplier effect starts to operate in reverse. Not only do the newly unemployed people become traumatized and see their purchasing power begin to evaporate, but those who are still employed also get scared and start scaling back on their spending. Local businesses begin to feel the brunt of it and start laying off their employees. Eventually, These local businesses close as the cycle continues a downward spiral. Soon you have foreclosures in the neighborhood, and then housing prices plummet, depriving people of hard-earned equity in their homes and making it difficult to sell property.
So then what happens when nothing intervenes to interrupt the downward economic spiral?
The consequences can be dire. We learned that in the Great Depression almost 100 years ago now. Locally, when the foreclosures and business closings continue unabated, eventually you end up with a lot of empty buildings, vacant houses, and abandoned warehouses. Over time, these empty buildings can become a real liability and a risk to the safety and sanctity of the community. Empty buildings tend to attract mischief, vandalism, graffiti, theft, and eventually arson. These are all the symptoms of the decline.
When you said earlier that we gave away this industry and the opportunities for growth, what did you mean by that, and how did we give it away?
It was ours to lose about 15 years ago. Goods movement, like any industry, is going to seek the most profitable and most efficient routes for distribution. In 2012, the San Pedro Bay was still handling as much as 40% of the goods that were imported to the U.S. About 2/3 of those goods were discretionary cargo, in other words, bound for other destinations east of the Rocky Mountains. Discretionary goods can come into the country at a variety of locations. The local harbor had the capacity to move containers quickly from the cargo ships to railroad trains that could take it all the way to the East Coast within a matter of days. The system worked well and was generally fairly efficient for about 35 years.
So why was the San Pedro Bay so critical to the nation's overall goods movement process in those 35 years?
Because no other facility in the country had the capacity to handle this kind of massive volume on this kind of gigantic scale. But then things started to change and we lost the advantage. Also, when emerging manufacturing sectors developed in places like India and Latin America, we missed the opportunity to attract that cargo, and we didn't evolve with the times. And what's worse, we allowed ourselves to be picked apart by our competition while we failed to settle our own local conflicts.
And what were those conflicts that allowed our competitors to pick us apart, as you say?
The primary conflict was a lack of collaboration and a lack of vision about the consequences of not cooperating with one another. Now, when ports have to spend their time and resources fighting court battles or threats of litigation, it becomes difficult to do the kind of strategic work which will develop future operations. Environmental impact processes that take forever keep everything in limbo. When the state legislature imposes environmental standards that are a major impediment to growth of any kind in transportation, this also sends a signal to the shippers who are shopping around for better alternatives.
Now, regarding pollution, are you suggesting that people have to put industry's needs ahead of their own health, well-being, and quality of life?
No, I'm definitely not saying that. People should expect to live in a relatively clean environment where the quality of life is good. Industry needs to be a careful steward of its resources and be mindful of the impact on the community. At the same time, industry can't do everything at once. The important thing is to make progress, to adjust to circumstances as they arise, and to be leaders in the kinds of innovative change that make industry sustainable for everyone. The industry tried to be as green as possible, but it wasn't doing enough or doing it fast enough for some.
I don't know if it would be completely fair to blame the industry's decline on health concerns by the community. I mean, surely it's more complicated than that. What else happened to hasten the decline?
Well, on another note, it's important to talk about the intersection of fees and bonds. Container fees are the elastic conduit from cargo movement to infrastructure development. When container fees are assessed for infrastructure improvement through bond financing, shippers can often justify the extra expense if the end result is more efficient movement through the port of entry and the related intermodal system. However, when local or state governments and regulatory authorities start to utilize the shippers' containers as cash cows for miscellaneous revenue collection, the freight can take flight for cheaper, less bureaucratic destinations. Now, once that freight leaves, guess what? The local or state authorities that took on the bond debt now find themselves unable to fully satisfy the payment schedule. Default on these bonds becomes a real possibility.
Okay, sir, I think we'll have to leave it on that somber note. We'll be back in a moment with our next story.